Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming along. We're just going to wait for the first minute just while everyone piles in. We've got quite a lot of people on the list today. So, and it's lunchtime, so we'll give people a chance to grab their sandwich. This session is being recorded just for everyone who has arrived so far. And we'll be starting in just a minute. We'll give everyone a chance.
Lovely to see so many familiar names.
And lots of new names as well. Fantastic.
Absolutely. Oh, lovely. It's been so lovely, Joe, hasn't it? Just like seeing the sun. Everyone just seems so much happier.
Yeah, I've definitely realised I'm solar powered.
Definitely.
Okay. Should we get started?
Absolutely.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Before we jump into today's session, I just want to take you through a quick moment to share one of the brilliant ways we are helping employees. We know that supporting your team's well-being goes beyond surface level fixes, whether it's developing new managers, building confidence, or helping team leaders navigate stress and overwhelm. Our therapeutic coaching service offers a tailored, structured support that actually works. So unlike traditional AAPs that can often fall short when specialist help is needed, our coaching has no retainer, no setup fees, and you only pay when you send someone to us. It's personal, it's practical, and it's results driven. If this sounds like something your team could benefit from and you want to find out more, then head over to the chat box. In just a moment, I will add the link to our brochure and details to contact me. Also, stick around to the end of today's session because we're going to be sharing how People is growing and what that means for this community. I'd now like to introduce Leanne from Beam, who is here to guide us through today's session on managing stress.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Lunch and Learn. I think it's the seventh free People Lunch and Learn we've done. We're determined to keep these free. We're determined to make them impactful. And we decided that we would choose stress for this session because it's Stress Awareness Month. And Tom and I both have a little bit of an issue with awareness days and awareness months. I don't know if you feel the same, that we get told to have this awareness, but we don't always get told what to do with it. And certainly when I'm working in therapy or coaching, what I'll often talk about with my clients is that self-awareness is a really good thing if we then know what to do with that awareness. But self-awareness without any idea of how to take action is actually torture, because I was better off being ignorant to it than being aware of it and having no idea how to deal with it. And so all of the sessions we deliver at Beam are very tools focused, giving you lots of tools and techniques that are really practical. And stress is probably one of the most popular topics that I ever deliver on. And whilst it's important we have an awareness of what it is, how it works, it's really important that we know how to manage it for ourselves. And as people, how we can support other people to manage it as well. And that's what this session is all about. So we're going to cover a few different things. This is kind of a snippet from my favorite workshop that I deliver, which is all about really the neuroscience of stress. So I'm going to talk to you about what stress is and the difference between stress and stressors and how they manifest in our life. Then I'm going to give you a very, very small neuroscience lesson to explain what's going on in your brain when you're stressed. You have probably noticed through your life that when you're stressed, you're not always the best version of yourself. You might be short-tempered, you might procrastinate, you might want to run away and hide from everyone. So I'll explain that to you and explain that in terms of how our brain is responding. Then I'll explain to you how when we're going through a stressful situation, the brain really only has 5 key ways to deal with it. So they're known as the 5 F's of stress. And hopefully, when I deliver that, people usually get a bit of a light bulb moment. And that will help you not only understand yourself better, which is really the purpose of all of these workshops initially, but it will also help you understand the people around you, the stress responses of others. So maybe you get frustrated because a colleague is always acting in a particular way. Maybe they're procrastinating. Maybe they never show up when you want them to. So I'll explain that to you and explain how we can deal with that better. And then I will explain, after you've got your neuroscience lesson, how you can better work with your brain to understand that stress response and complete the stress cycle. So, how you can work with that in a much better and healthier way. So, plenty to cover in essentially about 35 minutes, I'm sure. If you have questions as we go through, or comments or interaction, then please feel free to share in the chat box. I will remind you again that this session is recorded, however. If you have a question you do not want to ask in a public forum, then we will turn off the recording at the end and you can ask a question then. And of course, we will share our contact details with you so you can reach out privately. I'm more than happy to answer a question and direct you and signpost you if I am able to. So let's get into understanding stress a little bit better. Now, stress is often seen as the enemy, as something really bad. In fact, there is probably a study out there for almost every mental and physical health complaint that will demonstrate that stress makes it worse. And what that does for many of us is it makes us believe that any stress is a really bad thing. But that's not actually the case. As human beings, we need stress in order to not only thrive, but actually to survive. Every single morning you have a shot of cortisol, the stress hormone, which helps you to get out of bed. If you didn't feel stress when you were crossing a busy road, you would just blindly walk across it. If you didn't feel some stress when there was a deadline approaching, you would probably never reach the deadline. And so it's a common misconception that all stress is bad, because that's not the case. However, I also work with people who tell me things like, I thrive off stress, I love stress. Now, there's some really interesting research on that mindset that I'll come to in a minute. But actually, if any of you have come across a graph called the Yerkes-Dodson law, what that shows us through the research is that there is a sweet point of stress where we can all thrive, where we feel that pressure and we've got our heads down and we think, yep, I can do this. But actually, it's quite a short window. After that, the stress tends to become a little bit overwhelming. We start to suffer a little bit. Perhaps we'll get headaches, our sleep will be interrupted. And ultimately, prolonged chronic stress can lead to mental and physical health complaints, as well as things like burnout, which I am seeing more and more in our therapy room. So there is a sweet point of stress, but actually, for most of us, what we need to do with stress is to dip in and out of it. And what I often describe that as being able to hit the accelerator, but also tap the brake. So stress is essentially the function within the body that tells us we need to be on high alert because there is something we care about potentially being threatened. And that will hit something in our system called the sympathetic nervous system as part of the autonomic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is essentially our inner accelerator. As I say, it's what gets us out of bed in the morning. It's what makes us cross a road safely. But just like if you're driving a car, if we always hit the accelerator, then we're either going to crash or we're going to run out of fuel. Equally, the flip side of the sympathetic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system, which is known as the rest and digest response. And if we look at it from a car point of view, that's our brake. And if I only ever hit the brake, then actually I'm never going to get anywhere or do anything. So People often think as stress and relaxation as almost being an on and off switch. I'm either stressed or I'm relaxed, but that isn't really how this nervous system works. It's more of a seesaw. So I can absolutely oscillate between a little bit of stress and then a little bit of relaxation, and I can fluctuate that throughout the day. Just like driving a car, if I'm driving a car, sometimes I need to put my foot down if I'm on the motorway. Other times I need to tap the brake. Other times I need to hit the brake hard. And so this kind of mindset helps us see stress in a much healthier way as something that we can work with rather than something we can fear. Now, what I like to refer to when I mentioned earlier, some people tell me I thrive off stress. Stress is amazing. Well, actually, there is a tiny bit of truth to that, and there's some really interesting research. There's a meta study that was overseen by Dr. Kelly McGonigal, who looked at multiple studies and studies that were done over a very long period of time. And these studies essentially were measuring people for how stressed they were, how they thought their lives were impacted by that stress, and how they thought their health was impacted by that stress. And as the years progressed, ultimately, some of those participants of those studies started to pass away. And some of them passed away before you would expect in a normal life expectancy. And what was so interesting in that study was it wasn't the people who were the most stressed who actually were dying prematurely. The people who were dying prematurely were actually the people who believed that their stress was having a really negative impact on their well-being. And so the mindset of I thrive on stress has a tiny little bit of an advantage, because if we see stress as something that is beneficial to us, then actually what that research study says, and it's been part of a meta-analysis since, is that, okay, a little bit of stress, as long as I feel I have the tools to cope with it, isn't a bad thing. And from my point of view, particularly from my therapy background, the tools to cope with it is the key thing. Because actually, none of us have ever been taught that. There is no, or certainly not in my day, and I think still not really, teaching in school of how to handle stress. There's no class or workshop that has ever told us how to handle stress. And so by the time we get into adulthood, what most of us have done is copied how our parents handled their stress, how we've seen it handled perhaps on TV or through friends and family. And we've learnt coping mechanisms that are sometimes good, sometimes bad. And that's how we now deal with stress today. So what I love doing with the people I work with is actually giving them solid science-backed coping mechanisms that not only help you feel better today, but actually empower you to deal with stress for the rest of your life. And one of the first things I like to do with people is to get them to identify the difference between stress and a stressor. So stress is that physiological response we experience when the brain either experiences a real threat, a perceived threat, or even a completely imagined threat. And that's a really important point, because I can see that there's a tiger there and get the stress response. I can think, oh, that bush is moving over there, I think it might be a tiger, and get the stress response. Or I could just be sat there and there's nothing changing in my environment, but I convince myself that there could be a tiger appearing any moment, and I'll get the stress response. So it's a real, perceived, or an imagined threat. The stressor is the thing that instigates that stress response. So whether it's a tiger, whether it's a deadline at work, whether it's a difficult client, whether it's an email, whether it's opening your inbox and you've got 1,000 emails, whether it's your child coming home from school and saying they've got to have a school trip tomorrow and they need lots of things to prepare for it. All of those little things are stressors. And the difference we have, I guess, today compared to how our ancestors dealt with stress is that most of the stresses our ancestors faced were much more physical stressors. So a predator, maybe running out of food, maybe extreme weather, maybe the threat of a rival tribe. So they were very physical. Most of the stresses we face today are actually more emotional. And so we might feel that we are perhaps not performing at work, or we've got a difficult colleague, or we're having a difficult time with our partner or our children, or maybe we're worried about money, or maybe we're worried about the state of the world as a whole. And those stresses, even though they're not as physical as facing a tiger, they still have that same physiological and psychological response within our body. And so, even though we are dealing with stresses on a moment by moment basis on some days, we actually are still dealing with a brain that is hardwired for these very present physical threats. In fact, neuroscientists suggest that our brain hasn't really changed in around 200,000 years. And yet the life we're living today compared to 200,000 years ago is very different. But that physiological and psychological response is pretty similar to those primitive times. And so what that means is that many of us, when we experience stress, will behave in a way that isn't like our normal self. And you've probably experienced that. You have probably known that there's times where you're snapping at your loved ones, or times where you just avoid, or you bury your head. And so there are lots of ways for us to look at that with the time frame we've got, and my kind of capacity to have to do something in a very short space of time. I'm going to give you a very brief neuroscience lesson based on the principles that some of you may have come across before of Professor Steve Peters. And Professor Steve Peters is a psychiatrist who came up with the chimp theory in about the 1990s. It's evolved a lot since, and some of you may have read The Chimp Paradox. It's a very well-known self-development book that is quite enlightening. Now, the first thing I need to say is, in order to explain this to you, I'm oversimplifying things. So neuroscience likes to, when it's explained, simplify what's going on in the brain. So we like to say, oh, this part of the brain is responsible for X, and this part of the brain is responsible for Y. And it helps us try and get our head around the thing that we're studying with the thing that we're studying. However, the reality is that it's much more complex than that. The best way I've ever heard it described is from a neuroscientist called Dr. David Eagleman. And he said that looking at the brain is like looking at a city from the air for the first time. So imagine you're in a helicopter, you've never seen a city before, and you're flying over it, and you're just in awe of everything going on, all the lights, all the cars, all the people. And then you say to the person taking you on this trip, so show me where the economy is within this city. Now, the guide could perhaps show you, well, this is like the financial district, or this is a manufacturing district, but actually it can't tell you where the economy is because so many aspects of that city are involved. That's what our brain is like in reality. However, for us to understand it clearly, and certainly for the purposes of this session, I'm going to simplify it, as does Professor Steve Peters, in a way that we can start to get to grips with what's going on in our brain when we're feeling stressed. So Steve Peters has done a lot of work with elite athletes, Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player, Chris Hoy, the cyclist. And in his work with elite athletes, he was amazed at the discipline that they had for their training. So they had discipline over their sleep, their diet, their exercise regime, their relationships, highly disciplined, and sometimes for 4 solid years. And yet what he saw was these really disciplined, in control athletes would sometimes get on the track or the pitch. And when they were on there, something would go wrong, and essentially they would flip their lids. Think of, oh, in the old days, it was John McEnroe throwing his tennis racket. There's footballers who have completely lost it and attacked a fellow footballer. There's golf players who have thrown their golf clubs around. And when observing that, it seems amazing that these people can have so much discipline, and yet in that moment, they potentially risk their entire career and they behave in such a different way. And so, through his work with these athletes, Peters highlighted that at different times, there are different parts of our brain that are more dominant. So, this is where we're simplifying a little bit. It doesn't mean the other parts of the brain aren't in action at all, but they're more dominant. And Peters identified three key parts of the brain that are doing this. So, first of all, he identified our inner chimp, which is where the chimp paradox comes from. And this is called the limbic region. This is where the amygdala sits, which is better known as our fight or flight response. And our limbic region is really the most animalistic part of us. It's the part of us that is most concerned with getting our needs and desires met. So it cares about our physical safety. It cares about our kind of resource safety, having enough resources. It cares about our troop. It cares about food. It cares about sex. So our core needs are being met with the limbic region. And our limbic region, or our inner chimp, sort of acts as our security guard. So every bit of sensory information that comes in through the brain will pass through the limbic region to make sure that we're safe, or if not, it will jump into action. So your limbic region is there really to protect you. We've then got the prefrontal cortex, which sits just at the front of the brain here. We've got the biggest prefrontal cortex of any animal by quite a long shot. It's the part that makes us human. It's the part of the brain that is responsible for critical thinking, rational thinking. It's aware that we need to compromise, that we need to collaborate. It's the human part of us. It's a really good part of us. And then we've got the parietal, which sits towards the back of the brain here. And Peters describes this as our inner computer. And your inner computer is responsible for all of those habitual behaviors, beliefs, the things that you've had running for year after year after year within your brain. For example, the way you brush your teeth. But also the parietal will take control of anything that you do on autopilot. So the way you make a cup of tea, the way you open your laptop in the morning, even complicated things like driving a car. I don't know if you've ever had the experience, if you're driving a route that you've driven a lot of times, you get there and all of a sudden you have this almost panic of thinking, oh my goodness, I can't even remember how I got here. Did I stop at that roundabout? Did I stop at that red light? That's when our parietal is in control. And just to reassure you, if anything threatening happened, your limbic region would jump in and you would absolutely know if you were doing anything that was going to risk you, you would be able to deal with that. Now, a Duke University study suggests that we're in the parietal or on autopilot about 40% of our day, which is quite shocking. About 40% of our waking day, we're doing what we've done over and over and over again, very automated. So the way that these three parts of the brain interact is that they're dominant at different times. So if I'm doing an automated behavior, my parietal will be more dominant. If I am training, telling a story, if I'm engaged in a calm, rational conversation with a friend or a colleague, my prefrontal cortex will be more dominant. So I'm in that human mode. If my needs feel threatened or are being threatened, my chimp will be more dominant. And what Steve Peters says is that our chimp is 5 times more powerful than our human. And what that means is if we are in a threatening situation, real, perceived, or imagined, then our chimp will jump in and deal with it long before our human has even realized that it's dangerous. So I don't know if you've ever had a situation where perhaps a ball is flying to your head and all of a sudden your hand goes up and you think, wow, I'm Superman. How did I do that? or maybe a car's coming around the corner and you just jump back, or your child is about to do something and get hurt and you just suddenly grab them. That's your chimp in action. It's amazingly quick, amazingly focused on your survival. It's got tunnel vision. It's very protective. It only really cares about your overall survival. And it's quite irrational. So it doesn't really care about long-term consequences. It just cares about the short-term consequences of you getting through. Now, if we are in physical danger, we absolutely want our chimp to be in charge. If you were being followed down the street at night, you want your chimp to take over, because your chimp will have tunnel vision. It will only focus on the threat. It will be really quick thinking, and it will enable you to have this kind of superpower of being able to see all of your exit strategies. However, if I have an email from someone that makes me feel threatened, then my chimp will jump in, and chimps are really quite poor at helping you when you're under emotional threat. They tend to make things worse. So when our inner chimp feels threatened, we activate that amygdala, that little part of the brain that's like about the size of an almond, that we know is the fight or flight response. Ooh, hang on. But actually, we don't just have the fight or flight response available to us. There are actually 5 responses that are available to us whenever we start to feel stressed, whenever our chimp starts to feel threatened. So let's put this in a physical sense first. So let's imagine we are being chased down the road. We could faint or flop. So that stress response is used less by humans, but absolutely, if stress levels get really high, we can faint or flop. It's our equivalent of playing dead. Sometimes that can save our life. Sometimes we faint, we manage to kind of avoid the horror of the situation, and it keeps us safe and alive. What we will always do when we're under any kind of stress is we will always freeze, even if it's only for a millisecond, but we can also stay frozen in a longer period of time. So if I'm being followed down the road and I think, oh, this person's walking a bit close to me, I could just stand really still. Maybe I'll pretend that I'm looking in a shop window. And what might happen is the person walks on by and I think, oh, thank goodness, I was just being a bit paranoid, and they walk on by and I'm safe. So the freeze response can work. Maybe we're walking down the road and we know this person's following us. So what we might do is, as we get around the corner, we might just start running for it. The flight response is actually a human being's preferred stress response. You might like to think you are from a long line of warriors and fighters, but the chances are we're from a long line of people who ran away, because they're the ones who survived long enough to procreate. So when we're stressed, what we want to do more than anything is run away from it, get out of there. The fight response is what we would do if we think, okay, maybe I can't outrun this. This person's getting too close. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to smack them one. Or I'm going to scream at them, or I'm going to pick up a stick and make myself look really big. So the fight response can save our life. And then the last response might seem a bit confusing, but it's one that we've all done. When we make a quick calculation, or rather our chimp makes a quick calculation, it will work out, am I faster than this person? Am I stronger than this person? What exit points do I have in milliseconds? And if it works out that I'm not faster, I'm not stronger, I'm not likely to be able to escape, then sometimes we will try and befriend the threat. And it's called the fawn response. So maybe I turn around and I smile at the person and I say, oh, have you got the time? I'm waiting for my best friend. They'll be here any minute. Oh, yeah, how are you? It's a lovely night. And we almost charm our way out of danger. Now, we will use all 5 of these. And if needs be, if our life depends on it, we will flip from one to another to get out of a bad situation. However, Every single one of us learns stress response as a child, and therefore will have a preferred stress response. So to put this in context, as a child, I grew up with two big brothers, older than me, but also stupidly huge, like 6'6", 6'3", and I'm sure they were that age as that height as kids. They were massive, certainly much bigger than me. And so when we were kids and we would fight or we would argue, if I tried to freeze, then actually they knew where I was. I was in the same environment. So that wasn't helpful. Playing dead definitely wouldn't have been that helpful, although I probably tried to pretend to be asleep sometimes. The flight response, I couldn't outrun them. They were huge. They had massively long legs, couldn't escape. The fight response, I mean, I definitely tried, because I remember vividly once my biggest brother holding me by the head whilst I was doing that thing, punching the air, and him laughing. So the fight response didn't work, but the fawn response was really successful. So I learned that if I was annoying my brothers and they were about to get stressed, if I then could make them laugh or share my sweets or do something, then actually the stress disappeared and I ended up being safe. By the way, my brothers are lovely people and it's not threatening. This is general growing up as a child. Now that stress response became my preferred stress response. And so as I got older, I used that in my friendships, in my romantic relationships, in my work life. And it wasn't until I started studying neuropsychology that I had a light bulb moment where I realized that this stress response that I had known as being a people pleaser wasn't a characteristic or a personality trait. It was a response I had learned over years and years, which highlighted that I was stressed in that moment. So if a friend was putting me on the spot saying, okay, well, what do you want to do next week? And I was saying, I don't mind, I'll do what you want. It was because I felt stressed. If a manager was asking me to take on more work than I felt like I could physically handle, and then I was going, okay, yes, it's because I felt stressed. Now, what's really interesting is when we look at each of these 5 Fs, we can see them playing out in the workplace. They just look a bit different. So fainting absolutely is a stress response. And I've actually coached a really successful medical executive who was great at her job, and then it changed and she had to go around the world giving presentations. And she hated it to the point that anytime she would stand there, she would literally faint. Now, it's an extreme way of getting out of giving a presentation, but actually what happened was she never had to do it because they couldn't ask her if she had fainted. The freeze response in a workplace looks much more like procrastination. Do you or someone you know always procrastinate, always put it off? That shows that you're feeling stressed. It's not a personality trait. The flight response looks more like avoidance. So the person who phones in sick, or the person who suddenly remembers they've got an appointment they'd forgotten about, or the person who can't show up for that meeting. It's avoiding a situation. The fight response, well, hopefully that's never physical, but it can be that employee that's difficult. We'd call them bloody-minded. They're stubborn, they're confrontational. So whenever they're asked to do something, they snap back. And so people stop asking them to do something. And then, as I've already highlighted, the fawn response is that people-pleasing response. Now, hopefully you are all sat there thinking, oh my goodness, this is where I sit. I can totally see that when I'm stressed, I do X. You may also notice that your stress response varies depending on your environment. So we can absolutely be more stressed and likely to perhaps fight in our home environment than we would at work. And that's because we're aware of the consequences. So if I did the fight response at work, in my position, I'm likely to upset or lose a client. If I did the fight response with Tom at home, then I'm likely to upset him, but we can sort it out and it'll be okay. So you might notice your stress response varies depending on the environment and the consequences. Now, of course, It's not just you that's doing this, it's every human you interact with. So think about a time where you've had a confrontation with someone, whether it's personal or professional. Maybe you're someone who wants to get things out in the open and sort it out straight away. And maybe that person opposite you has just completely shut down. They won't answer you. And you might interpret that as they don't care, but actually they're probably in the freeze response. Maybe they always storm off and you don't get a chance to resolve anything because next thing you know, they're out the door. That's the flight response. Or maybe they always go, oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm really sorry. It's all my fault. Let me go and make you a cup of tea. That's the fawn response. The better we are at understanding the stress responses of others, if we look at it through a professional capacity, is that we can give people space for their stress levels to decrease so we're not keeping them in that stress state. So if I notice I have a colleague that is procrastinating a lot, I can make sure I'm not giving them extra work. I can ask them if they need extra support with something. If I notice I have a colleague that's becoming a little bit confrontational and difficult, I can ask them, how can I support you? What do you need taken off you? And so the better we are at doing this, the better we'll be in all our relationships. And by all means, this massively applies to your relationships at home. You might be sat there thinking of your partner, your parent, your sibling. Absolutely, you can become aware of this. In your close relationships, I always suggest that you have this conversation and say, I've learned this thing. What do you think your stress response is? Okay, so the next time we're having a heated discussion, let's just give each other 20 minutes. It takes about 20 minutes, by the way, for your human to come back online and your chimp to calm down. Let's give each other 20 minutes and then come back and try and talk about it. Now that brings me quite nicely to this idea of the stress cycle. If I go back to that explanation of the F responses being triggered by something very real and physical, if I am being chased by a tiger, there's a cycle that takes place that's really quite simple. So I sense a stressor, there's a tiger over there, and as I sense the stressor, it starts to activate the stress response within me. So my heart rate goes faster, I start sweating, I get a rush of blood to my limbs to prepare me to fight or flight. My vision becomes very tunnel vision, so I'm focused on the threat, I'm not distracted by everything else. My hearing becomes heightened, and maybe I decide to start running. And as I start running, there's really only two ultimate outcomes. I survive the tiger or I become tiger lunch. If I become tiger lunch, then that stress response is absolutely closed off. If I survive the tiger, there is a moment where I realize that that stressor has gone and I start to complete the stress response. So what that looks like is maybe I'm running, I start screaming for my fellow tribe, they start throwing sticks and stones and spears at the tiger, and the tiger runs off. I then have a moment where I do a massive exhale. I might cry. I might hug my fellow tribe and we might celebrate and cheer. I might kind of sit quietly for a moment. I might shake. That's quite a primitive response to stress, but it's really effective. But that stress response that I'm giving all indicates to my brain that the stressor is gone, and therefore I can move off the accelerator and come back into the brake. The problem most of us have now with our emotional stressors is it's never that clear that they're gone, or they go on for a very long time. If you don't like your job, it's unlikely to just be one day I don't like it, and at the end of that day, it's done. We could, but it's unlikely. We're likely to be in that environment for a long time. And so there's amazing research. And if any of you were worried about burnout or feel you're at burnout, there's a great book by the Nagoski sisters called Burnout, Nagoski. And they highlight 6 science-backed ways to complete the stress cycle that we can just do at the end of a working day or at the end of a difficult conversation. Their number one way to deal with completing with your stress cycle is to move your body. If the body wants to activate that flight response, do it. So run, jump, have a dance around your kitchen, stamp your feet, shake, whatever it takes, move your body. Have a good cry. Many of us believe that crying is a bad thing, but nothing that happens in the body is for no good reason. The reason we cry, particularly after a stressful situation, is because it's a great way of releasing the neurochemicals that have been built up in our system, like the cortisol, the adrenaline, and the epinephrine. It means that we can release them through our tears. They literally come out through our fluid. It's also why we have nervous wheeze and poos. Breathe, change your breathing. When you're stressed, your breathing will be very shallow, very rapid, maybe a little bit sighing as well. Doing just 60 seconds of calm breathing. There's a lovely breathing technique that's been really researched called the physiological sigh. And that's where you do 2 inhales, a slow exhale. So you do that 5 times, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Laugh. Laughing releases things like oxytocin, which works on a seesaw with cortisol as well. So when the oxytocin goes up, I start to feel good. I start to feel safe. Do something creative. You cannot use your chimp and your creative brain at the same time. So anything, whether it's cooking a meal, whether it's gardening, whether it's painting a picture, playing an instrument, all helps complete the stress cycle. And then the last one is hug. So it takes us about 20 seconds of hugging. So it's a long time if it's just a colleague, so maybe not, but with a loved one, 20 seconds of hugging to release oxytocin. So if we have a hug with someone, we actually reduce our stress hormones and feel better and complete that stress cycle. So this is a huge topic. I mean, I run hour-long, 2-hour-long workshops on this frequently, and I've tried to give you as much as I possibly can. A couple of things I think that are really worth taking away. Stress is a natural response, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to learn to tap the brake a little bit. When we're stressed, we're more likely to behave with one of the 5 F's of stress. So start to be aware of that. Look at how other people deal with it. Look at how you're responding. And we need to practice completing the stress cycle to ensure we hit those breaks with those 6 science-backed ways. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, you can either ask at the end of this or drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to help. I will pass back over to Tom.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you very much for the session. Do you want to click through to the next slide? So we are really pleased to let you know that one of our plans to grow this community is working with Wales HR Network to bring you more value to these people sessions. They're doing some fantastic work across the sector, and I'm here to tell you about their Future of Work conference, which is taking place on the 14th of May at the ICC Wales in Newport. It's set to be an incredible day with expert speakers from organisations like ACAS and CIPD and the Institute for the Future of Work. Topics include everything from the 4-day working week to AI in the workplace, neurodiversity, and how to support a multi-generational workforce, plus panels, keynotes, workshops packed with practical insights. We'll be sharing full details of this event and how to book in the post-session notes, so keep an eye out for that email. So what's next? We will be sending out the replay and resources after this session. They'll be emailed to everybody that's registered. If you would like to talk to us further and find out more about how we can support your team, then reply to the follow-up email or reach us through our Beam training website. You can also join the People Network, which is our LinkedIn group where we share clips of these sessions, updates, articles, and events. And finally, I've put the link in the chat, but you can sign up to our next session, which is Overcoming Imposter Syndrome, on the 13th of May. That, of course, will be in the link for that will be in the email as well, and you can find that on our website. So thank you very much for coming along. What we're going to do is we're just going to stop the recording right now, just in case anyone wants to ask any questions. So recording has stopped.